You are not educated. This is not a slur, a personal attack, or a cheap provocation. It is a diagnosis, a reasoned conclusion drawn from the most fundamental laws of thought, the laws of logic that underlie all understanding, all speech, all judgment. These laws are not optional. They are not elective cultural artifacts. They are universal, inescapable, and silently operative in every human mind, whether acknowledged or not. To be uneducated is not merely to lack a degree, nor is it to be unfamiliar with certain facts or fields of study. Those are surface-level metrics. The deeper meaning is this. To be uneducated is to be unaware of, indifferent to, or incapable of applying the basic principles of reasoning that give structure to knowledge and coherence to thought. This is not a condition of innocence. It is often a condition of willful neglect. And worse still, this neglect is frequently accompanied by intellectual laziness, a conscious or unconscious avoidance of the effort required to think clearly, examine one's own beliefs, or subject one's views to critical scrutiny. Ignorance, in this deeper sense, is not a blank slate. It is a disorder of the mind, marked by unearned confidence and a resistance to rigor. It manifests not just in what is unknown, but in what is unquestioned. Opinions held without justification, assertions made without logic, and assumptions protected by emotion rather than tested by reason. And yet many who suffer from this condition wear it as a badge of authenticity, mistaking stubbornness for strength and self-expression for truth. They substitute amusement for attention, distraction for discipline, and spectacle for knowledge. My aim is not to belittle or insult such people. That would be too easy and entirely unproductive. Instead, my purpose is to expose ignorance as a measurable failure of reason and to challenge the thinker to confront it. All thought, whether coherent or confused, whether rigorous or reckless, rests inescapably on the laws of logic. These are not optional rules, chosen or ignored like opinions or preferences. They are the structural conditions of meaning itself, the principles that make thought possible and communication intelligible. To be human is to think, but to think well, to think in a way that respects reality, coherence, and truth, requires conformity to logic, the discipline that governs valid reasoning. Among these foundational laws, consider a few that operate silently beneath every sentence, every belief, and every debate. The law of non-contradiction. A thing cannot both be and not be in the same respect at the same time. A statement cannot be true and false simultaneously without collapsing into nonsense. The principle of sufficient reason. Every assertion must have a basis. Nothing can be accepted as true merely because it is said. It must be supported by reason, by evidence, or by logical necessity. The rules of valid inference, forms such as modus ponens, if A, then B, A, therefore B, and modus tollens, if A, then B, not B, therefore not A, govern how conclusions legitimately follow from premises. These are not the tools of philosophers alone. They are the grammar of coherent thought itself. To speak, to argue, to assert a belief or deny another's view is to invoke logic, whether one knows it or not. Even the most casual conversation relies on these laws to carry meaning. One does not need to believe in logic to be bound by it, just as one does not need to believe in gravity to be subject to its force. To reject logic is not rebellion, it is self-defeat. Invoking its structure without mastery and contradicting yourself with every word, it only ensures that you violate it unknowingly and disqualify yourself in the very act of speaking. Ignorance does not begin with silence. It begins with violation, the breaking of logical law, while pretending one's words retain authority. Consider the person who claims all opinions are equally valid, but in the next breath declares someone else's opinion wrong or harmful. This is not an error of preference, but a logical contradiction. If all opinions are valid, none can be wrong. If one is wrong, not all are valid. The claim devours itself, and what remains is not disagreement, but incoherence. The argument is not defeated, but it destroys itself. Or take the person who argues in circles, saying, "I'm right because I know I'm right." This is not reasoning, but an arrogant intellectual retreat. The claim lacks justification beyond its own repetition. It's a textbook case of begging the question, a fallacy in which the conclusion is assumed within the premise. It is not an argument at all. It is a performance of confidence meant to conceal the absence of reason. What such examples reveal is not merely error, but a failure to grasp how thought itself is structured. And this failure is what defines ignorance. Not the lack of knowledge, but the lack of competence in knowing. The inability to recognize when an idea is coherent and when it is incoherent, when it holds up under scrutiny and when it collapses. The authority of logic is not loud. It does not demand belief. It simply operates silently and absolutely behind every conversation, every belief, every attempt at persuasion or protest. When you break its laws, your words may still echo, but they no longer carry meaning. They no longer connect to reality, to truth, or to anything beyond your own internal noise. And this is where ignorance begins to show. Not in silence, but in the confident sound of an argument or assertion that cannot bear its own weight. To be educated is not to possess a diploma, nor is it to parade facts like trophies. Education is not certification, it is cognitive competence. It is the practiced ability to think, to reason, and to discern. An educated person is not one who knows everything, but one who knows how to know, who respects the processes of reasoning and is willing to be corrected by them. True education means wielding the tools of the intellect, to evaluate claims based on evidence, not impulse, to recognize bias, especially one's own, before condemning others, to follow valid inferences where they lead, even if they contradict one's prior assumptions, to retract or revise a belief when it fails to meet the standard of reason. This is not academic elitism, but the baseline for intellectual competence. By contrast, ignorance is not simply the absence of knowledge. It is the absence of epistemic discipline, the absence of an internal standard by which beliefs are tested and refined. It is not merely not knowing. It is not knowing how to know, and worse, not caring to. To be uneducated, in the meaningful sense, is to be untethered from the very processes by which knowledge becomes possible. It is to speak without rigor, to believe without reason, and to argue without structure, while still expecting to be taken seriously. It is in essence a form of epistemological blindness, a refusal or inability to see how thought functions and why its rules matter. More troubling than ignorance itself is its increasing celebration. In some circles, ignorance has become a kind of badge of authenticity, a defiant rejection of elitist thinking, where emotion is mistaken for depth and impulsive opinion is elevated as moral clarity. Rhetorical fallacies, once seen as errors, are now common habits. The straw man replaces sincere engagement. Distort what someone believes, then attack the distortion. The red herring becomes a smokescreen. Distract from the real issue with something irrelevant but emotionally charged. The appeal to emotion replaces evidence. If it feels true, it must be. These are not just bad habits. They are the markers of a mind that has abandoned the effort to think. Why does this happen? Because fallacies are easy. Because critical thinking is hard. Because the labor of reasoning demands humility, and humility requires strength. To genuinely think is to face the risk of being wrong, and that, for many, is too painful. So they choose the alternative, intellectual laziness dressed up as conviction. This laziness is not quirky or harmless. It is not a mere personality flaw to be chuckled at. It is a failure of duty to oneself and to society. It is a betrayal of the mind's potential. For the human mind, properly disciplined, is capable of extraordinary clarity, subtlety, and insight. But undisciplined, it becomes little more than a megaphone for emotion, impulse, or ideology. The uneducated mind does not seek truth. It seeks comfort. It seeks validation. It seeks ease. And in doing so, it trades away its greatest asset, the ability to navigate a world filled with complexity, contradiction, and competing claims. To choose intellectual laziness is to commit a quiet form of cowardice, a retreat from the challenge of thinking, masked as self-assurance. This cowardice is not private, it is contagious. When enough people adopt it, entire conversations collapse into a fog of empty words. Societies become vulnerable to propaganda, to demagogues, to ideological tribalism, and to collective self-deception. Ignorance may begin in the individual, but it never ends there. When you violate the laws of logic, you do not simply make a mistake. You commit a disqualification of your own reasoning, a structural failure that renders your position not just incorrect, but incoherent. You remove your argument from the realm of rational discourse, and you do so while continuing to speak as if you still belong there. This is the essence of rational shame. The exposure of your thoughts' collapse, not by insult, but by the unflinching structure of logic itself. Consider the person who proclaims with absolute confidence, "Freedom of speech means I can say what I want without consequences," while simultaneously demanding punishment for speech they personally dislike. Their contradiction is not subtle. It is internal sabotage. They invoke a principle only to betray it in practice. They demand the protections of free speech for themselves, then cheer its suppression when it targets views they oppose. This is not moral clarity, but logical hypocrisy dressed in the costume of righteousness. Formally, it is known as the fallacy of special pleading, applying a standard to others while exempting oneself. The rationalist should call it out directly. You claim to believe in free speech, yet you support silencing views you oppose. This isn't an argument, but a contradiction that refutes itself the moment it's spoken. Then deliver the diagnosis of shame. This is not an argument, but the visible collapse of cognition under the weight of its own contradictions. You are not reasoning. You are flailing in a fog of your own making, unwilling to wield the only instrument that could guide you through this process, logic. Your incoherence is not merely incorrect. It is symptomatic of intellectual dysfunction, the product of a mind untrained in the discipline it dares to mimic. What you present as certainty is merely unexamined arrogance, and before the tribunal of reason it is stripped bare. You are not simply wrong. You are unqualified to speak with authority. The discomfort you feel is not an attack. It is a signal. Your ego signaling the disparity between who you believe yourself to be and what your reasoning reveals. You can either face that signal and begin the beautiful ascent toward rational competence, or remain where you are, ignorant by choice and exposed as such by every word you speak. This is not cruelty or mockery. It is the scalpel of reason, cutting through the fog of your arrogance to reveal the truth. You are uneducated, not because you lack facts, but because you lack the courage and discipline to reason. This kind of exposure stings, and it should, but not because it is cruel. It stings because it holds up a mirror to the ego. and the ego sees what it would rather avoid: its own incompetence masquerading as insight. The shame is not emotional in origin. It is cognitive in nature. It emerges from the tension between what a person wants to believe about their own intelligence and what their argument has just proven to the contrary. Many who dwell in ignorance are not merely uninformed, they are inflated with false self-confidence. They confuse the strength of their conviction with the strength of their position. They speak loudly, forcefully, and often, but they speak from a foundation they cannot defend. This is what makes exposing their logical failures so powerful. Not because it humiliates, but because it undermines the illusion of competence that sustains their arrogance. You do not need to shout. You do not need to insult. You need only to name the violation, point to the contradiction, and let logic do the work. Let it do the cutting. The blade is clean and impersonal. What remains after logic has removed the noise is the truth of the matter. The person has made a claim they cannot defend, used a structure they cannot follow, and revealed a mind that cannot distinguish between persuasion and posturing. This approach of rational shame produces discomfort not because it wounds the person, but because it reveals a wound already present. That wound is the dissonance between self-image and intellectual reality. They see themselves as thoughtful. They present themselves as reasonable. But their words, when pressed under the weight of logic, betray them. And once seen, it cannot be unseen. The value of this discomfort is that it has direction. It is not shame for the sake of defeat. It is shame that points toward growth, toward humility, toward the possibility of becoming intellectually legitimate. It is a pressure that can either break the ego or purify it. The choice is theirs. The irony is razor sharp. Those who reject logic must still employ it to make their case. They construct arguments against reason, use language that presupposes coherence, and expect their audience to follow their claims and arrive at agreement, all acts grounded in logic. Even in their attempt to dismantle the authority of logic, they must tacitly submit to it. This is not merely ironic, it is intellectually fatal. You are using logic to argue that logic doesn't matter. This is not merely self-defeating, but it's intellectually disqualifying. The trap is inescapable because logic is not one framework among many. It is the precondition for intelligibility itself. It is a scaffolding of all coherent thought, the invisible architecture that makes meaning possible. To argue against it is like using oxygen to deny the necessity of air. It is a self-refuting gesture that collapses under the weight of its own contradiction. And yet, this is the preferred mode of the intellectually lazy. Undermine the rules while benefiting from the order they create. Speak without structure. Assert without evidence. Deny the value of thought while demanding that yours be respected. And why does this happen? Because thinking is hard, and intellectual laziness offers an easier path, a path of least resistance. The untrained and undisciplined mind gravitates toward amusement, toward the fleeting pleasures of distraction. The endless scroll of social media, the algorithm-curated echo chambers of confirmation, the short-form content designed not to provoke thought, but to bypass it entirely. In this ecosystem of mental sedation, critical thinking is not just rare, it is actively discouraged. Why struggle through complexity when comfort is one click away? Why wrestle with contradiction when certainty can be purchased wholesale in prepackaged ideological slogans and comfortable narratives that long ago rejected any accountability to logic? But the choice to avoid thinking is not a passive one. It is a decision with consequences, and those consequences extend far beyond the individual. This intellectual laziness, this refusal to engage in the labor of understanding, is not a harmless quirk. It is a failure that has a negative hidden outcome. An uneducated mind does not merely fail to protect itself from error. It becomes a vector for it. It spreads misinformation, falls for cheap manipulation, and reinforces simplistic narratives that crowd out nuance and clarity. Such minds cannot spot fallacies, cannot distinguish evidence from opinion, cannot tell when they are being deceived, and cannot contribute meaningfully to public discourse. They lack the tools to resist sophistry and mistake vehemence for validity. They are puppets in the theater of deception, speaking with the force of conviction, but the substance of confusion. Often proud of their ignorance, absorbing falsehoods uncritically and repeating them with unearned authority. In this way, the uneducated mind becomes a liability, not just to itself, but to every system that depends on reasoned judgment, education, democracy, science, justice, and community. We do not live alone in our minds. The quality of one's thinking has consequences for all of us. At its core, intellectual laziness is not just a lack of effort, it is a lack of courage. It is the refusal to face uncertainty, to endure the discomfort of being wrong, to do the necessary work of thinking through complexity. It is both cowardice masquerading as confidence and convenience dressed as conviction. And just as physical laziness weakens the body, intellectual laziness atrophies the mind until the person can no longer distinguish between truth and noise, reason and rhetoric, freedom and manipulation. If logic is the engine of clear thought, then laziness is the rust that seizes the gears. And the weakness of that mind that is too afraid to stand up to the crowd, too afraid to challenge its peers. This is among the most pathetic states a mind can occupy. Terrified not by violence, but by independent thought. Any brute can throw a punch in a crowd. That requires only impulse and muscle. But to think clearly in defiance of fashion, and to speak truth when surrounded by error, this is the mark of true psychological strength. If we are to speak of power, Let us be precise. The powerful are not those who dominate others, but those who master themselves in the pursuit and defense of reason. You are uneducated, but you need not remain so. This is not a condemnation, but there is an invitation here. The exposure of your ignorance is not your end. It is the chance for a real beginning. The shame one should feel at intellectual weakness, laziness, and cowardice is not punishment. It is a signal, a flare launched by reason itself. It is the pain of realizing you are not who you imagined you were. Let that pain be your turning point. Let your ego, wounded but intact, become your engine. When properly directed, even pride can serve growth. This is why Nietzsche communicated the way he did. Because he realized that he couldn't directly communicate with humans entrenched in egoism. So he tried to use the egoism to motivate his fellow humans toward the existence of a higher culture. Let your ego demand more from you than comfort and distraction. Let it make you hunger for clarity, for competence and truth. Let it elevate you through reason, as opposed to destroying you through the ignorance of irrationality. Begin with logic. Start at the foundation. Study the laws of thought, the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, the law of excluded middle, the principle of sufficient reason, and the rules of valid inference. These are not optional intellectual tools. They are the very conditions that make coherent thought possible. If you do not know these principles, you are not reasoning, you are merely reacting. You are an impulse-driven automation. If you violate them, you are not thinking, you are flailing. Learn how to construct an argument. Learn how to detect a fallacy. Learn to ask, what follows from this, and what justifies that? This is not some ivory tower academic snobbery, but the foundation of cognitive self-respect. Cultivate intellectual humility. To be wrong is not a flaw in your character. It is a feature of your condition. Fallibility is not an insult. It is the inescapable price of thinking in an uncertain world. The refusal to admit this is not strength, but fragility masquerading as confidence. The uneducated mind clings to the illusion of certainty. It fears correction, resists revision, and treats being mistaken as a threat to self. The educated mind, by contrast, understands that to be wrong is not to be defeated, but to be given a gift, a clear view of reality than it possessed before. Errors are not signs of failure. They are the raw material of growth. Each flaw in your reasoning is a signal, a door, if not slammed shut by pride. It can be opened into greater understanding. Intellectual humility is the discipline of walking through that door, of seeing mistakes not as humiliations to hide from, but as instruments to sharpen your mind. Truth is not possession, it is a pursuit. And in that pursuit, Your errors are not disqualifications. They are the very terrain you must cross to arrive anywhere worth going. Do the intellectual work. This is not about absorbing facts like trivia. It's about discipline. Read books that demand something of you. Study both logic and critical thinking like a demon or a fiend. Engage with arguments that challenge your worldview. Seek out thinkers who are not on your side. Question your own beliefs with the same vigor you question others. Don't argue to dominate. Argue to understand. Don't seek to be affirmed. Seek to be refined. And above all, persist. Persevere. Thinking is labor. Reflection is labor. Clarity is earned slowly, painfully, through friction and revision. There are no shortcuts. No algorithm will make you wise. No one can reason for you. This is your work. This is the weight your mind must learn to carry. Resist the lure of amusement. Amusement is not neutral. It is anesthetic. It numbs your mind while flattering your instincts. It rewards your attention with momentary pleasure while stealing your long-term capacity to think deeply. Don't spend your life mindless scrolling. Disengage from the algorithm that feeds you exactly what keeps you passive. Reject the validation of echo chambers, reaction memes, ideological bait. Amusement is cheap. Understanding is costly. One depletes you, the other builds you. The work of becoming educated will often feel like resistance training, even punishment, difficult, uncomfortable, and at times thankless. But it is in that resistance that strength is formed. This path is not about earning credentials or sounding impressive. It is about reclaiming ownership of your mind. It is about no longer being a passive consumer of ideas you barely understand. It is about no longer being manipulated by every charismatic fraud or seductive narrative. It is about refusing to drift through life as a puppet, a pawn, a passenger in a world that demands discernment. This is about becoming sovereign in your own thinking, so that when you speak, your words mean something, so that when you listen, you can discern signal from noise, so that when you live, you do so by light and not in the confusion of an irrational darkness. Ignorance is a condition, but it is a curable one. Laziness is a habit, but it is breakable. Reason is your instrument, but it must be sharpened. And the sharpening begins when you recognize your own ignorance and lack of education, and take it upon yourself to shape your mind as many shape their bodies. This can be simplified. Educate yourself in critical thinking, argumentation, and logic. You are uneducated, not because you lack access to information, nor because you never attended a university, but because you fail to meet the basic standards of rational competence. You dismiss evidence. You violate the laws of logic. You prefer comfort over clarity. you choose the seductive ease of ignorance over the strenuous discipline of understanding. And in so doing, you condemn yourself to intellectual irrelevance. Your laziness has forged the bars of your cage. Your arrogance has locked the door. But the key has always been in your hand. The laws of logic are not biased. They do not judge you unfairly. They are not moved by emotion or credentials. They're impartial and unrelenting, concerned only with coherence, validity, and truth. They expose your contradictions. They reveal your fallacies. They shine a cold light on your refusal to do the work that thinking well demands. You are not disqualified by external force. You are disqualified by your own words. Every time you contradict yourself, argue without reason, or parrot what you do not understand, you present the evidence of your uneducation, not metaphorically, but literally, as undeniably as a failed equation, as publicly as your last comment, your last post, your last argument. This admonition is not an insult. It is a diagnostic mirror. It does not hate you, it reflects you. Look into it. See the cracks in your reasoning. See the laziness behind your beliefs. See the arrogance behind your certainty. And if you feel shame, discontent at your ignorance and lack of education, this is a good thing. It means that you have seen the cage that many merely die in. That is not punishment. It is the first step toward change. Shame, when earned, is the internal recognition that you are not living up to what you could be. It is a signal, a summons, a call to fight back against what has now been realized. You do not need to remain uneducated. The path out is steep and it is narrow. It demands effort, humility, discipline, and the courage to confront your own ignorance. It demands that you earn the right to speak meaningfully, that you master the tools of reason before claiming to possess conclusions. You can stay as you are, loud, wrong, and self-satisfied, confident and content in your ignorance, or you can begin the quiet, painful, noble work of becoming clear, sharp, and intellectually honest. The choice is entirely yours. But do not mistake this freedom for immunity. The laws of logic are sovereign. They do not care how loudly you protest. They do not care about your ego, your identity, your followers, your feelings. They care only whether your thoughts hold up under scrutiny. And until they do, you are what your own reasoning reveals you to be, uneducated and ignorant. Only another decision can change that. Not a gesture, not a posture, but a true commitment. And that commitment is the commitment to learn how to think honestly and how to reason rigorously and well. You don't know it yet, but reason is your greatest ally in the war of life. It is the supreme, non-violent weapon that trumps all other weapons. Those who lack it, no matter how physically strong they may be, are really weak. And those who have it, no matter how physically weak, they may be, are really strong.